Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've never been much of a camper, but when my girlfriend Amy suggested we go on a weekend camping trip with her brother, Ben, and his girlfriend Kelsey, I didn't want to seem like a buzzkill. "It'll be fun," Amy promised, her eyes bright with excitement. A weekend disconnected from everything. I didn't share her enthusiasm, but I went along with it anyway. I wish I hadn't. We left early Saturday morning, a 2-hour drive out to the national park that Ben had picked. The campsite was isolated, just the way he liked it, far off the beaten path, deep in the woods, where even the faintest trace of a phone signal was non-existent. As we pulled up to the trailhead, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. The trees towered over us, gnarled and thick, their shadows stretching like fingers across the forest floor. The sun, though bright, seemed muted here, as though the trees were swallowing the light. I shrugged it off, blaming it on my reluctance to camp. Ben and Kelsey were already setting up their tent by the time Amy and I unpacked our gear. The air was unnaturally still. No wind, no birds, just a heavy silence that felt like it pressed down on you from all sides. I glanced at Amy, but she didn't seem to notice. She was laughing with Kelsey as they hammered the stakes into the ground. Once everything was set up, we hiked down to the lake. It was a small, stagnant body of water, surrounded by thick reeds and fallen logs. The stillness was eerie. No ripples, no insects buzzing. Just a flat, dark surface that reflected the sky like glass. I stood at the edge, staring into the water, and for a split second I thought I saw something. A shadow. Something moving beneath the surface. But when I blinked, it was gone. Ben slapped me on the back, snapping me out of it. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he laughed, but it sounded forced, like he was trying to shake off the same strange feeling I had. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We cooked over the fire, shared a few drinks, and by nightfall, the odd feeling in my chest had mostly faded. We sat around the fire, Ben telling some exaggerated story about his job, while the flames crackled and spat in the cool night air. The woods around us were pitch black, the trees now looming like dark walls, separating us from the rest of the world. Then, around midnight, the noises started. At first it was subtle, just a low rustling in the trees like the wind picking up. But there was no wind. The air was completely still. We all stopped talking, the sound too strange to ignore. The rustling grew louder, moving around us, circling the campsite. "Probably just a deer," Ben said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then we heard it, a low guttural growl, deep, hungry. It reverberated through the trees, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "What the hell was that?" Kelsey asked, her voice tight with fear. Ben stood up, shining his flashlight into the woods. "Could be a bear," he said, though we all knew bears didn't make sounds like that. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trunks of the trees, but nothing else, no movement, just more of that unsettling silence. Then we heard the footsteps. Slow, heavy. They crunched through the underbrush, moving steadily toward us. But no matter how hard Ben shone the light, we couldn't see what was making them. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the air suddenly thick with tension. Amy grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We should go back to the tent," she whispered. "Get inside." Ben scoffed, though there was a nervous edge to it. "It's probably just some animal. We'll be fine." But Kelsey was already backing toward the tent, her eyes wide. "Ben, please, I don't like this." The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. We all stood there, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, from just beyond the light's reach, came a voice. "Kelsey?" It was a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but there was something wrong with it. It was off, like the words didn't quite fit the shape of the mouth saying them. Kelsey froze, her face pale. "Kelsey, and come here." It was her mother's voice, her mother who had died 2 years ago. We all heard it. There was no mistaking it, but it didn't make any sense. Kelsey's eyes filled with tears as she backed away from the woods. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." Ben grabbed her, pulling her close. "We need to get inside the tent. Now." We scrambled, rushing toward the tents, the fire suddenly feeling like a weak shield against whatever was out there. The rustling had started again, louder now, more frantic, as if something was moving through the trees, circling, closing in. That growl, low and rumbling, followed us. Inside the tent, we huddled together, our breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The only sound was the frantic rustling outside, growing closer and closer until it was right up against the fabric of the tent. And then, silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of our breathing and the oppressive quiet of the woods. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in place. Minutes, hours. Time didn't seem to move. And then slowly, we heard it again. "Kelsey, come here." The voice was closer now, just outside the tent. It was wrong. Too wrong. The cadence was off, like it was mimicking her mother but couldn't quite get it right. And this time it was accompanied by another sound, something scratching against the tent's fabric, slowly, deliberately, like nails dragging across nylon. Ben unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, his flashlight shaking in his hand. There was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of anything. But I knew we weren't alone. That night, none of us slept. We kept the fire burning until dawn. The voice whispering intermittently from the woods, calling for Kelsey, sometimes shifting into other voices. Familiar voices, my brother's, Amy's father's, Ben's old college roommate. All people who were long gone. The voices coaxed, pleaded until the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, and then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the voices stopped. We packed up in silence, no one daring to speak about what had happened. By the time we made it back to the car, I felt like I was waking from a nightmare. But as we drove away, leaving the dark woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. That night, back home, I was lying in bed, Amy asleep beside me, when I heard it again. A whisper, barely audible, from just outside our window. "Come here." It was Amy's voice, but Amy was right there next to me, and I realized then we hadn't left it behind. It had left with us. I've always loved camping, the peace, the solitude, the freedom. But after what happened last weekend, I don't know if I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me and 2 of my friends, Jason and Mark. We'd found a secluded spot online, deep in the heart of a national forest, hours away from the nearest town. It was one of those places you couldn't find on a map, a hidden gem. The perfect getaway, we thought. The drive up was long and winding, the road narrowing the deeper we went into the forest. The trees grew taller, their branches thick and tangled overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. By the time we found the spot, the sun was already setting, casting a deep orange glow over the treetops. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent, gathering wood for the fire, the usual routine. The air felt fresh, clean, and there was a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and unnerving. No cell signal, no other campers, just us in the wilderness. As night fell, we sat around the fire, laughing, telling stories, roasting marshmallows. It felt perfect. But then, just as we were settling in, Jason paused mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the trees behind me. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I hadn't heard anything, Mark hadn't either, but Jason insisted he heard something moving in the woods, just out of sight. We listened for a moment, the fire crackling, the woods completely still. Then, faintly, we all heard it, a low shuffling sound like something dragging across the ground. It was coming from somewhere beyond the tree line, out in the thick black woods. It didn't sound like an animal, not any animal I'd ever heard anyway. It was too deliberate, too slow. We sat there silent, straining our ears. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped. Mark chuckled nervously, brushing it off. Probably just a raccoon or something. Jason didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and went along with it. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. I didn't say anything to the others, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could tell Jason was on edge too. He kept glancing at the trees, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Eventually, we all went to bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the night, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me, just that something wasn't right. The air inside the tent felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth. I could hear Jason and Mark breathing softly beside me, their forms barely visible in the dim light. And then I heard it, that same dragging sound, closer now, much closer. It was coming from right outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged. The sound was slow, rhythmic, like something was crawling through the dirt just feet away from where we slept. I didn't dare move, barely even breathed, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could be. I wanted to wake Jason and Mark, but fear held me in place. Then I heard the tent's zipper. It was faint, just the smallest pull, like someone testing it. My blood turned to ice. I strained my ears, listening as the zipper moved again, this time lower just a few inches. I couldn't stay still anymore. I turned my head slowly toward Jason, but he was still asleep. I reached out to shake him awake when, suddenly, the zipper stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. And then, just as I was about to move, the dragging sound began again, this time moving away from the tent, back into the woods. I lay there, paralyzed, until the sound faded into the distance. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted, my body aching from the tension. Jason and Mark were still asleep, completely unaware of what had happened. That's when I saw them, footprints, dozens of them, all around the campsite. Deep, heavy prints in the dirt, circling our tent, leading off into the trees. But they weren't normal footprints. They were long, almost like a person's, but stretched, distorted. And they didn't look fresh either. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, even though the dirt was freshly disturbed. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced with possibilities. A prank, some kind of animal, maybe even a hallucination from lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I woke Jason and Mark, showing them the prints. Jason's face went pale. "That's not right," he muttered, his voice shaky. Mark tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We packed up quickly, none of us wanting to stay any longer. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, just out of sight. The woods felt darker, more oppressive, like they were closing in on us. Every now and then I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We finally made it back to the car, loaded our gear, and drove out of there as fast as we could. None of us spoke on the drive back, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we stopped at a gas station, miles away from the forest, that Jason finally broke the silence. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely audible. Mark and I both turned to him. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Last night," he continued, staring down at his hands, "when you two were asleep, I heard something moving outside the tent. I thought it was an animal, But then I saw it. This thing. It was crawling through the dirt just outside the firelight. It looked human, but wrong. Like it had been stretched out, like its body didn't fit together the way it should. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. It was dragging something behind it. I don't know what. I didn't want to look too close. I was so scared I couldn't move. I thought I was imagining it, but now, after seeing those footprints... He trailed off, his voice shaking. Mark and I just stared at him, both of us too stunned to speak. We never went back to that forest, never spoke about it again, but I think about it sometimes, about that thing Jason saw, about the prints, about the zipper, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with us. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being completely alone in nature that calms me, helps me reset. So when I found this spot online, a secluded forest deep in the Pacific Northwest, it seemed perfect. No tourists, no cell phone signal, just me and the trees. I packed up my gear and set out for what I thought would be a peaceful weekend of camping. The trailhead was hard to find, almost like it didn't want to be discovered. My GPS kept glitching, but I chalked it up to the remoteness. After hours of hiking, I finally found the clearing I'd seen online. It was surrounded by towering pines, their branches so dense they blocked out the sunlight, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But the spot was perfect. Quiet, isolated, and far from any sign of civilization. As evening fell, I set up my tent, built a fire, and settled in. The first strange thing happened just after dusk. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance, when I noticed the forest around me was too quiet. No crickets, no birds, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. Just silence. It felt wrong, unnatural, but I brushed it off as city nerves. Maybe I just wasn't used to this level of quiet. But then came the footsteps. Faint at first, like someone walking through the underbrush. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my imagination and retreated to my tent, hoping that sleep would come quickly. It didn't. Around midnight I heard the sound again, footsteps, but this time they were closer, circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the knife I always kept in my pack and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. My flashlight flickered as I swept it through the trees, the beam weak and erratic. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I could still feel it, though. That heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, and after what felt like an eternity, I crawled back into the tent. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers, faint, unintelligible, like they were carried on the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, suffocating. I couldn't tell if the voices were outside or in my head. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot and I was ready to pack up and leave. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just one weird night. So I stayed, and that was my mistake. The second night, everything escalated. It started with the fire. I had gathered wood earlier and set it ablaze just after sunset. But as I sat by it, trying to convince myself that the daylight had burned away the fear, the flames suddenly died, snuffed out like someone had thrown water on them. I scrambled to relight it, but the matches wouldn't catch. It was as if the air itself refused to ignite. Then the noises returned, this time louder. Footsteps, yes, but also something else. Breathing. Ragged, heavy breathing. It was all around me, surrounding the camp. My flashlight, now fully dead, was useless. I could feel the presence, whatever it was, getting closer. I ran for my tent, but before I could reach it, I saw something move in the trees. At first it was just a shadow slipping between the trunks, but then I saw it. Pale, gaunt, and inhumanly tall. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, not with light, but with something darker, something wrong. It didn't move like a person, more like It glided, its limbs too long, its face twisted in a permanent silent scream. I froze, my body refused to move. The thing stared at me from the edge of the clearing, and then, slowly it pointed. Not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, and that's when I saw them, figures, dozens of them standing just beyond the ring of trees. They were transparent, like wisps of smoke, but they were there, silent, watching. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hungry. Panicking, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away. Branches tore at my skin, and my lungs burned as I ran through the trees, but no matter how far I went, I could still hear the footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Eventually I collapsed, exhausted, and waited for whatever it was to find me. But the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. Slowly, I lifted my head, half expecting to see the pale figure looming over me, but there was nothing. I was alone. Shaking, I got back on my feet and somehow managed to stumble back to my campsite. My tent was gone. Everything, my gear, my supplies, vanished without a trace. In their place was something else, an old, rotting campsite, the remains of a tent torn and weathered with age. But this campsite, it looked familiar. And then it hit me. It was mine. My backpack, my supplies, everything. It was there, but aged, decayed, like it had been left there for years. I heard the whisper again, closer this time. You never left. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't remember how I made it out of that forest, but when I reached the trailhead, something was waiting for me. An old, rusted sign I hadn't noticed before, half buried in the dirt. It read, "Trail closed, missing persons, 1974." And, beneath it, almost too faded to read, "Do not enter after dark." As I stood there trembling, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. A voice, faint and distant, whispered, "Welcome back." And that's when I realized I'd never left. I was one of them now, trapped in that endless ghostly cycle. No one ever leaves. I've always been a sucker for the quiet, the solitude of the wilderness. I craved it. When I was younger, my dad and I would disappear into the woods for days at a time, living off the land, sleeping under the stars. So when my friends bailed on our annual camping trip last minute, I didn't care. I'd go solo. A weekend away, deep in the forest, sounded perfect. Or at least, it should have been. The trail was familiar, one I'd hiked a dozen times before. I knew every twist, every tree, every hidden stream. After hours of walking, I found the perfect spot, a clearing surrounded by thick pines, just far enough off the main trail to feel truly isolated. I set up my tent as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. That first night started off normal enough. I lit a small fire, cracked open a beer, and just listened. The woods were alive, chirping insects, distant rustling, typical forest sounds. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I felt the tension of city life melt away. But as the stars began to disappear behind a thick layer of clouds, something changed. The noises of the forest, once so calming, suddenly felt different, off. The rustling, the chirping, even the wind seemed to quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. And then I heard it, this low, distant hum. It was faint, barely audible over the dying fire, but persistent, like a far-off engine that never got closer, never faded away. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks, but I couldn't shake this strange, nagging feeling crawling up my spine. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and tried to sleep. I must have drifted off at some point, but the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, every nerve in my body on edge. A twig snapped outside, the sharp crack echoing through the stillness. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear past the pounding of my heart. Another sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My mind raced. A bear? No, bears are clumsy. Whatever was out there wasn't. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, casting long shadows across the nylon walls of my tent. I waited, praying the noises would stop, that whatever it was would leave. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer, circling again and again, pacing, like it was trying to make up its mind about something. I could hear it breathing, low, raspy, unnatural. Suddenly, the side of my tent bulged inward, like someone, was pressing their hand against it. I could see the faint outline of fingers through the fabric. Too human, too close. I bolted upright, unzipping the tent and bursting into the night air, my flashlight darting wildly through the trees. Nothing. No one. The forest was empty, but that hum, louder now, drifted through the trees like a warning. I stood there for what felt like hours, just waiting, every hair on my body standing on end. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, but I couldn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, jumping at every whisper of wind, every crackle of the embers. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I was about to leave, I found something. Right outside my tent, pressed into the dirt, were footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. But they weren't mine. These were larger, barefoot, fresh. I hurried back to the trail, refusing to look over my shoulder. I felt watched the entire hike back, that same low hum vibrating through the trees, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached my car, it was practically a roar in my ears. I jumped in, slammed the door, and floored it out of there, not daring to look into the rearview mirror. For the next week, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the hum stayed with me. At night, I'd hear it faintly, coming from somewhere outside my apartment. I told myself it was the city, background noise, traffic, but it never went away. It just kept getting louder. 2 days ago, I woke up to find dirt on my bedroom floor. Footprints. Bare, human footprints leading from the door to my bed. I moved out yesterday. But tonight, as I sit in this motel room, miles away from the forest, from my old apartment, I hear it again. That hum. Low, persistent, right outside my window. And this time it's accompanied by footsteps. They're circling, just like before. Only now I'm nowhere near the woods. The unsettling hum and footsteps weren't confined to the forest. Whatever followed the narrator home seems to have bridged the gap between reality and something darker, more sinister. The noises, so unexplainable and seemingly tied to the wilderness, now haunt the narrator wherever he goes, showing that no place, no distance can separate him from whatever has marked him. The isolation and dread aren't from the woods themselves, but from something much closer, something that's found him and refuses to let go. I've been an outdoor enthusiast for most of my life, camping, hiking, just being out in nature. That's where I've always found peace. But this trip was different. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, just me and the mountains. I'd picked a spot deep in the wilderness, far away from any other campers or trails. It was perfect. Or at least, it seemed that way at first. The hike to the campsite was uneventful, quiet even. The trees stretched tall and thick on either side of me. The only sound, the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call. By the time I reached the clearing I'd scouted out earlier online, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going before night fell completely. There's something about being out in the wilderness at night that's both exhilarating and terrifying. The total isolation, the absolute darkness. No city lights, no noise pollution. Just the night and whatever hides in it. As I sat by the fire, the sky turned from purple to black, the stars beginning to blink into existence above me. It should have been peaceful, but the woods felt off. The usual symphony of nighttime creatures, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals was absent. The air felt too still, too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Sometimes nature is just weird like that, or at least that's what I told myself. It wasn't until I was lying in my tent, the fire reduced to glowing embers, that the unease really settled in. I could hear the wind picking up, whispering through the trees, but it carried something with it. A faint sound, barely audible over the breeze. It was crying. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound was so soft, so distant, but it persisted, faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice, sobbing somewhere far off in the woods. I told myself it was an animal, foxes maybe. They make some eerie sounds at night, something that could be mistaken for human crying if you're out here alone and letting your mind play tricks on you. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. I lay there in my sleeping bag, paralyzed with indecision. Should I check it out? Stay put? What if someone was lost out here, hurt and in need of help? That thought was enough to get me out of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and stepped into the darkness. The crying had stopped, replaced by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing, half expecting to see someone stumbling through the underbrush. Nothing. Just as I was about to retreat back into the tent, I heard it again. Closer. This time, unmistakable. Human. A woman's voice crying softly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" No response. Just the crying. I couldn't just ignore it. I turned, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound, and began walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. The light cut through the thick underbrush, casting strange, dancing shadows across the trees. "Hello?" I called again. The crying stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a switch. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick, as though the entire forest was listening, waiting. And then I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight aimed at the trees, but again, nothing. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling for explanations. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or something, startled by my presence. But there was no sound of retreat, no crashing through the brush like a startled animal would make. Just quiet. That's when I noticed something. The woods felt wrong. The trees, they were too close. The underbrush too thick. This wasn't the direction I'd come from. I turned slowly, trying to retrace my steps, but the clearing wasn't there. Panic started to rise in my chest. I couldn't have gone far. I'd only walked a couple of minutes from the tent, and yet the path was gone. There were no markers, no sign of the firelight in the distance. It was like the forest had shifted, rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. My breath quickened as I spun in circles, shining the flashlight desperately into the dark, searching for any sign of where I'd come from. And that's when I saw her. A figure standing just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. A woman. Her hair was long, tangled, and she wore what looked like a thin white dress that was tattered at the edges. Her head was down, her face obscured by the shadows. But what unnerved me the most was her posture, unnaturally rigid, as if she were frozen in place. "Hey!" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't move. I took a step forward, and the beam of the flashlight flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, I heard it, a low, guttural whisper right next to my ear. "Help me!" I jumped back, my flashlight flickering back to life. The woman was gone. I spun around, frantically searching the woods, but there was no sign of her. The forest was empty. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart. I don't know how I made it back to my tent. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, twisting and warping with every step I took. But eventually I stumbled into the clearing, the dim glow of the fire's embers still burning in the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the dying fire, gripping the flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The crying never came back. At first light, I packed up my things and got the hell out of there. The hike back to my car felt like a fever dream. The woods were still too quiet, the air too thick with tension. It wasn't until I was safely back in my car, driving down the winding mountain roads, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I didn't talk about what happened. I tried to forget it. But last night I was going through my camera, looking at some of the photos I'd taken during the trip. One of them wasn't mine. It's a photo of me standing in the clearing, staring out into the woods. But I didn't take it. And behind me, in the shadows between the trees, stands the woman in white, her head tilted, staring. I've always loved camping. The peace, the quiet, the sense of being disconnected from the world. It's always been something I looked forward to. But after what happened at Silent Lake, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the woods again. There were 3 of us, me, my best friend Tom, and his girlfriend Jess. We had planned a weekend camping trip at this remote lake we'd heard about through a friend of a friend. No one else had ever been there, or at least that's what we were told. The directions we got were vague, but after a 2-hour drive and another hour hiking through dense forest, we finally found it. Silent Lake lived up to its name. It was a small, still body of water, surrounded by trees so thick they felt like walls. The water was dark, almost black, with no ripples, no movement, just completely, unnervingly still. There were no signs of other people, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. It was like no one had ever been there before us. At first it was perfect. We set up camp near the shore, built a fire, and spent the evening relaxing. The silence around the lake was odd, but we joked about it, saying how it was nice to be away from the noise of the city. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of water lapping at the shore. Just pure silence. That night, things took a turn. I woke up around 2 a.m. to an eerie low hum. At first, I thought it was just in my head, that maybe the quiet had started to mess with me. But then I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. It was like a low, rhythmic humming, coming from somewhere across the lake. I sat up in my sleeping bag and looked around. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow around our campsite. I could see Tom and Jess still asleep in their tent. I listened, trying to pinpoint the sound, but it was so faint I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. Then the water caught my eye. At the far end of the lake, something was moving. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a ripple spreading across the surface. But as I watched, it became clear that it wasn't just the water. There was something in the water. A figure. It was barely visible, just a dark shape, but it was there, standing in the middle of the lake, motionless. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there, just standing, staring. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My eyes stayed locked on the figure. Then slowly, it started to move. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, almost floating, across the surface of the lake, closer, closer to our campsite. I panicked. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the lake, but the beam barely pierced the darkness, and the figure, whatever it was gone. I sat there frozen, listening to the silence. No hum, no sound, just dead quiet. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I didn't mention what I saw. I wasn't even sure if it was real. But Tom noticed something off about me. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, laughing as he cracked open a can of soda. "Rough night?" "Just couldn't sleep. Heard some weird noises," I muttered, trying to sound casual. "Probably just the forest," Jess said. "It's creepy out here, but it's nothing to worry about." but it was something to worry about. That evening things got worse. We spent the day hiking around the lake, but the whole time I felt like we were being watched. Every time I turned around, I'd catch a glimpse of something between the trees, just for a second. A shadow, a flicker of movement. But every time I tried to get a better look, there was nothing there. Just empty forest. By the time we got back to camp, I was on edge. Tom and Jess were still in high spirits, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night we were sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows and joking around, when Jess stopped mid-sentence. She was staring at something over my shoulder, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw what she was looking at. Across the lake, at the exact same spot I'd seen the figure the night before, was a man. He was standing in the water, half submerged, just staring at us. He was tall, his clothes soaked and clinging to his body. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, God, his eyes, they were wide open, fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Tom stood up, grabbing a stick from the fire. "Hey, you okay, man?" he shouted across the lake, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, the man dropped beneath the surface, no splash, no sound. He just disappeared into the water like he was pulled under. We all stood there in stunned silence, staring at the spot where he vanished. The lake was calm again, the surface perfectly still, like nothing had happened. "I think we need to leave," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. We packed up camp in record time. None of us spoke as we loaded our gear into our bags, the only sound the rustling of tents and zippers. But the whole time, I felt like we were being watched. As we hiked back through the woods, the feeling only got worse. The silence was deafening, oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Then, about halfway back to the car, Tom stopped abruptly. "Where's the trail?" he muttered, turning in circles. "What do you mean, where's the trail? We've been on it this whole time," Jess said, sounding annoyed. But she was wrong. The trail was gone. The path we'd been following for hours had disappeared. We were standing in the middle of the woods with no idea where we were. "That's not possible," I said, looking around. But the truth was sinking in. The trees around us were different, unfamiliar. We were lost. And that's when we heard it, the hum. That same low, rhythmic hum from the night before, coming from somewhere in the distance. But this time, it was louder, closer. No. We turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it again. The man, standing between the trees, watching us. He was closer now, his face visible in the dim light. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, but there was something wrong about him, something unnatural. His skin looked bloated, waterlogged, like he'd been submerged for days. And then he took a step forward. We ran. I don't remember how long we ran for, but somehow we found the car. We didn't speak, didn't look back, just threw our stuff in the trunk and sped away from Silent Lake as fast as we could. I haven't seen Tom or Jess since that trip. They don't talk about it, neither do I. But sometimes, late at night when it's quiet, I hear that hum, and I wonder if we ever really left that lake at all. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, just me, my brother David, and our old college friend Sarah. We hadn't been camping together in years, and life had gotten so busy that the idea of being off the grid for a couple of days sounded perfect. No work, no phones, no distractions, just the three of us, a campfire in the untouched wilderness. We found the spot online. It wasn't a registered campsite, just some hidden location in the middle of the forest that a guy David knew had told him about. Completely secluded, he'd said. You won't find another soul out there. That sounded like exactly what we needed. The drive out was long and winding. The deeper we went into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The paved roads gave way to gravel and eventually to dirt. We didn't see any other cars, and after about an hour of driving on that dirt road, we found the trailhead. Everything seemed perfect at first. The air was crisp, the trees towering and ancient, their branches casting long, shifting shadows as the sun sank lower. We hiked for about 2 hours before we reached the spot, a small clearing nestled between towering pines, with a creek running nearby. It was beautiful, and exactly the kind of peaceful escape we'd hoped for. By the time we set up camp, night was starting to fall. We got a fire going, cooked some food, and sat around reminiscing about old times. The fire crackled, and the only sounds were our voices and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Everything felt right until the woods went silent. It happened so gradually that at first I didn't notice. One moment, there was the distant hum of crickets and the soft hooting of an owl somewhere far off. Then, nothing. No wind, no animals, no sound at all except the crackle of the fire. I felt it before I really understood it. The sudden weight of the silence, like something pressing down on my chest. David was mid-sentence when he stopped, his face going pale. Sarah noticed it too. We all sat there staring at each other, the firelight flickering in our eyes. "Do you guys hear that?" David finally asked, his voice low. "No." We all listened, but there was nothing to hear, not anymore. "No," Sarah whispered. "I don't hear anything. That's what bothered me the most. The woods are never truly quiet at night. There's always something. Crickets, rustling leaves, animals moving in the dark. But this was unnatural." I shrugged it off, trying to break the tension. "Maybe a predator is nearby," I said. "Animals get quiet when there's something dangerous around." "Like a bear?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "Could be," I said, though even I didn't believe it. The stillness wasn't just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to push the feeling aside. We were in the middle of nowhere. Of course it felt strange. We were just being paranoid. We kept the fire going for a few more hours, but the fun had faded. We all felt it. That sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the firelight. By midnight, we decided to call it a night. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The silence was deafening, my ears straining to catch any sound, any sign of life outside. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping noise like something being dragged across the ground, slow and deliberate. I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from outside the tent. I glanced at my phone, 3:14 a.m. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal passing through, but the sound didn't fade. It grew closer, more insistent, like something was circling the campsite. I quietly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows across the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees, dark and silent. But then in the dim light, I noticed movement near the edge of the woods. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong. It was hunched over, its limbs too long and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It dragged something behind it, something heavy, but I couldn't see what it was. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched it move around the edge of the clearing, always staying just within the shadows, never stepping fully into the light. I wanted to scream, to wake David and Sarah, but fear kept me paralyzed. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just watched, my breath shallow, my body frozen with terror. The figure circled our campsite once, twice. Each time it seemed to drag its burden slower, more deliberately. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, tried to tell myself it was just an animal, or maybe some weird trick of the light. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening. The silence was unbearable. And then, in the blink of an eye, it vanished. not into the woods, not into the shadows. It was just gone, as if it had never been there at all. I lay there motionless until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I barely slept, my mind replaying what I'd seen over and over, trying to convince myself it had been a dream or a trick of exhaustion. But when I stepped outside the tent in the morning, I knew it hadn't been. David and Sarah were already up, both of them pale, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Did you hear it?" David asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Sarah looked at us both, her face ashen. "There were footprints outside my tent," she whispered. "Big ones, and something else." We followed her to the edge of the clearing. There, in the dirt, were long, deep tracks. Not boot prints, not paws. Something else entirely. They dragged through the dirt, leading off into the woods where the figure had vanished. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a knife, old and rusted, with a handle worn down by time. It was covered in dark stains, like it had been buried there for years. None of us said a word. We packed up our gear in silence, moving quickly, not daring to look into the woods. We left the knife where it lay. We hiked back to the car in record time, none of us speaking until we were back on the highway, miles away from that place. Even now, I don't know what we saw, what was out there in the woods that night. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure, hunched and wrong, dragging something heavy through the trees. And I can't stop thinking about the knife. Who left it there, and what were they dragging? There's a spot in the national forest that most people don't know about. A friend of mine, Ryan, had stumbled on it by accident a few years back while backpacking off-trail. And ever since then, it became our secret place to camp. No signs, no paths, just a small clearing nestled between a rocky cliff and a deep, still lake. It was perfect. Or at least, we thought it was. Last fall, we planned one final trip before the weather turned cold. Just me, Ryan, and our friend Matt. We packed light, planning to hike the 6 miles into the clearing and spend the weekend fishing and enjoying the quiet. No one ever came out that far, so we were guaranteed complete isolation. The hike in was uneventful, just the steady rhythm of our boots crunching the fallen leaves and the occasional chatter about work or life. The air had that crisp, cool bite of early autumn, and the sky was a dull gray, thick with clouds that promised rain. By the time we reached the clearing, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees and sending ripples across the surface of the lake. We set up camp quickly, eager to get a fire going before the sun dipped behind the cliff. I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. I told myself it was the weather. Overcast skies always made things feel gloomier. But as I stood by the water, staring into the murky depths, a chill crept up my spine. Something about the stillness of the lake unnerved me. There wasn't a single ripple, not even a fish breaking the surface. It was as if the water was holding its breath, waiting. The first night was fine. We ate, laughed, and swapped stories by the fire. But as the night dragged on, that unease grew. The forest around us seemed unusually quiet. No owls, no rustling animals, not even the familiar creak of tree branches in the wind. Just silence, the kind that presses in on you, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. At some point, Matt stood up, stretching his arms. "I'm going to hit the sack," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Ryan and I nodded, still staring into the flickering flames. We were tired too, but neither of us moved right away. There was something unspoken in the air. Both of us felt it, but neither wanted to admit it. Eventually, we doused the fire and headed to our tents. I don't know how long I lay there, listening to the wind whip around the clearing when I first heard it. A low, steady drip. At first, I thought it was rain. Maybe the weather had finally broken. But as I listened closer, I realized the sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the lake, slow and deliberate, like something thick dripping into the water. Drip, drip. It was an unnatural sound and it made my skin crawl. I strained to hear it again, but the wind picked up, drowning it out with its howling. I convinced myself it was nothing. A fish, maybe, or water running off a rock. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I mentioned the dripping sound to the guys. Ryan shrugged it off, but Matt looked uneasy. "I heard it too," he said quietly. "It sounded like it was right outside my tent." We laughed it off, but the tension in his voice stuck with me. Something was getting under our skin, though we weren't ready to admit it yet. That day we fished at the lake, but it was strange. Nothing was biting. The water was clear, but there was no life. No fish, no movement beneath the surface, just an eerie stillness. By mid-afternoon we gave up, frustrated and on edge. As evening approached, the wind died down, and a thick fog began to roll in across the water. It settled in the clearing, clinging to the trees like smoke. We sat around the fire, each of us more subdued than the night before, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. That's when we heard it, a splash. It was loud, sudden, as if something huge had broken the surface of the lake. All three of us froze, staring at the water. The fog was so thick now that we couldn't see the shore, but the sound was unmistakable. Something had disturbed the water. "What the hell was that?" Ryan muttered, his eyes wide. "Probably a fish," Matt offered, but his voice was shaky. We both knew there was no fish that big in that lake. For a long moment we sat there, the fire crackling as we stared into the fog, and then we heard it again. Drip. Drip. That slow, deliberate sound like something thick dripping into the water. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously approached the shore. The fog was so dense we could barely see a few feet ahead. As we neared the water, the dripping sound grew louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to turn back, but we kept going. Suddenly, Matt stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I squinted through the fog, and my breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the reach of our lights, was a figure. It stood motionless at the water's edge, its back to us. Tall, too tall to be human, with long, spindly arms that hung unnaturally low. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was turned ever so slightly, as if it was listening to us. "Is that a person?" Ryan whispered, though he already knew the answer. We didn't move, we didn't breathe. We just stood there paralyzed, staring at this thing that shouldn't exist. And then, slowly, it began to turn. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. As it rotated, we saw its face, or rather the lack of one. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, like someone had wiped it clean. And then it tilted its head, as if it was considering us. Without a word, we turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, our hearts pounding in our ears. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like forever. We didn't stop until we reached camp, panting and terrified. We packed up in silence, our hands shaking as we threw our gear into our bags. None of us dared look toward the lake, but I could feel it. I could feel those empty eyes watching us from the fog. We left that night, hiking through the dark, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. By the time we reached the car, the sun was just starting to rise, casting the world in a pale gray light. We didn't say a word on the drive home. None of us ever spoke about what happened that weekend, not to each other, not to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear it again, that slow, steady drip, and I'll remember that faceless thing standing at the edge of the lake, listening, waiting, and I'll know that it's still out there in the fog watching. It was supposed to be an escape. I had been dealing with a lot at work, and my personal life wasn't much better. The stress was getting to me, and I needed a break. Just me, nature, and the quiet. I'd always found camping alone to be a good way to clear my head, to reset. So when I found a secluded spot near the base of the Rocky Mountains, far off the beaten path, I didn't hesitate. A weekend away in the wilderness was exactly what I needed. I arrived just before noon, the sun high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the endless stretch of trees. There was no cell reception, exactly what I wanted, and not another soul in sight. The trail I followed was barely a trail at all, more of a suggestion than a path, winding deeper into the forest. After hiking for a few hours, I found a clearing that felt right, isolated, surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek flowing nearby. The perfect spot. I set up my tent, built a small fire pit, and made myself a simple meal as the sun started to dip behind the mountains. The air grew cooler, and the shadows lengthened, but I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. Camping alone was second nature to me. As the night crept in, I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The crackling flames were the only sound, accompanied by the gentle flow of the creek. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. But then, I noticed something odd. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves just hours earlier, had gone completely still. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just an eerie, suffocating silence. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to shake off the sudden unease that settled in my chest. It's just your imagination, I told myself. The woods are supposed to be quiet at night. I turned in early, the silence still pressing in on me as I zipped up my tent. Lying there, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I tried to relax. But something felt wrong. That stillness outside seemed unnatural, too perfect, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch like a footstep just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, this time closer. It was the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking through the underbrush. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I was miles away from the nearest town. There shouldn't be anyone out here. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, trying not to make any noise. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. Another footstep, even closer now. It was right outside. I flicked on the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one quick motion, shining the beam out into the darkness. The light cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just the still, silent forest. I stepped out, sweeping the flashlight in every direction. Nothing. The ground around the tent was undisturbed, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. I stood there for a moment, heart still racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods can play tricks on you, especially at night. I went back inside the tent, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch kept me on edge. Hours passed, and I must have eventually drifted off, because the next thing I remember is waking up in a cold sweat. Something was wrong. I lay there, listening. The silence had returned, heavier than before, but there was something else, something off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The sound of the creek had stopped. I shot up, my heart pounding. The creek, which had been flowing steadily since I arrived, was completely silent. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The fire had long since gone out, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the clearing. I walked toward the creek, the flashlight beam bobbing in front of me, but when I reached the bank, I froze. The creek was there, but it wasn't moving. The water was perfectly still, like glass. No ripples, no current, just a motionless, silent stream. That's impossible, I thought. A stream doesn't just stop. Suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt it. That undeniable sensation of being watched. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned around, shining the light back toward the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my beam caught something in the distance, just beyond the tree line. A figure, standing perfectly still. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. It was a person, at least it looked like a person. Tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long, standing motionless between the trees. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a head and body, black against the pale moonlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. "Are you lost?" I tried again, taking a step closer. Still no movement. A deep primal fear took hold of me. Something was wrong. Very wrong. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place, staring at this figure in the dark. Then slowly, it took a step forward. I bolted. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. My flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, illuminating glimpses of the trees as I sprinted back toward the trail. Behind me I could hear it, the soft, deliberate footsteps keeping pace. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how I made it, but somehow I reached the trailhead. I threw my pack into the car and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? Even now, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I think back to that figure in the woods, the way it just stood there, watching. And I wonder if one day I'll see it again. There are places in the world that feel untouched by time, places where the line between the real and the unreal blurs. I learned this the hard way on a camping trip last fall, a trip I won't ever forget, a trip that changed everything. It was me, my friend Kyle, and his younger brother Ethan. We were headed to the Pine Hollow Reserve, a thick forest way out in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. Kyle had heard about a hidden trail there, one that supposedly led to an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. We were all experienced campers, so the idea of exploring a forgotten place excited us. We left early that Saturday, eager to find this so-called hidden trail. When we arrived at the reserve, the usual paths were well maintained, but Kyle wanted something different, something off the beaten track. So we hiked deep into the woods looking for any sign of a trail that had been neglected or overgrown. By mid-afternoon we found it, an old narrow path barely visible under the thick canopy of trees. It was covered in leaves and branches, clearly unused for years. But there was something about it that drew us in, something that made us feel like we had to follow it. We hiked for what felt like hours. The forest around us grew denser, darker. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches casting long, finger-like shadows across the ground. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves. Eventually, we found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, hidden by the forest's dense growth. The wood was old and rotting, the windows shattered, the door hanging slightly ajar. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the lantern hanging by the door. It was old, rusted, but the flame inside flickered faintly, as if it had been lit just minutes before. "Who the hell is out here?" Ethan muttered, glancing at me and Kyle. None of us had an answer. We hadn't seen another soul the entire hike. "Maybe it's someone's idea of a prank," Kyle said, though his voice wavered. Still, curiosity got the better of us. We approached the cabin cautiously, our eyes on the flickering lantern. There was no sign of anyone inside, just dust, cobwebs, and the faint smell of something rotting. Ethan reached for the lantern. Whoever left this must be around here somewhere. Maybe. Before he could finish, the lantern went out. Just like that, the flame vanished and the clearing was plunged into an eerie twilight. It felt like the air got colder, heavier. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like something had shifted, like the forest had come alive and was watching us. "We should go," I said, my voice tight. Kyle nodded, and Ethan, for once, didn't argue. We backed away from the cabin, trying to retrace our steps down the trail. But the trail wasn't there anymore. The path we had come in on, the one we'd followed for hours, it was gone. No faint track in the leaves, no break in the trees. Just an unbroken wall of forest all around us. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Kyle asked, sounding more panicked than I'd ever heard him. "No," I replied, scanning the dense woods. "We didn't." The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows in the forest were growing longer. We had no choice but to keep moving, hoping we'd somehow find our way back. But as we walked, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence around us was thick, oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, steady, just far enough away that we couldn't see who or what was following us. We turned, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah, we heard it," Kyle muttered, gripping the flashlight tightly. We picked up the pace, but the footsteps followed, always keeping just enough distance to stay out of sight. And then, in the distance, we saw it, the flicker of a light. A lantern. It was the same one from the cabin, swinging slowly between the trees, its flame glowing faintly in the growing darkness. But there was no one holding it. It moved on its own, gliding through the woods as if being carried by invisible hands. "Is that the same lantern?" Kyle whispered, though we all knew the answer. None of us moved. We just stood there frozen, watching as the lantern bobbed closer. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared in the light, just behind the lantern. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face I couldn't quite make out. His body seemed to fade into the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes, they were wide and dark, and they locked onto us. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We ran. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. We sprinted through the forest, branches slapping our faces, the sound of our own breathing ragged in the still air. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel it, the presence behind us. The footsteps growing louder, closer. Every time I looked back, the lantern was there, swinging slowly, the figure always just behind it, always watching. We ran until we couldn't anymore, our legs burning, lungs aching. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the lantern had disappeared, the footsteps gone. But we were still lost. The forest felt endless, like it was swallowing us whole. The trees twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The sky above seemed darker than it should have been, and the silence. The silence was suffocating. "We have to keep moving," Kyle said, though he looked like he was barely holding it together. And so we did. We walked for hours, maybe longer, the woods stretching on forever. And just when I thought we were doomed, that we'd never find our way out, we stumbled onto the road. It was sudden. One minute we were surrounded by trees. The next we were standing on the old dirt road that led back to the reserve parking lot. Relief flooded through us. We didn't question it. We just ran. When we reached the car, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. We piled in, none of us saying a word, and Kyle floored it. We didn't talk about the lantern. Not until a few days later, when I decided to look up the history of Pine Hollow Reserve. That's when I found the story. Years ago, a man had lived in the cabin near the river, a recluse, or so the locals said. He was known for wandering the woods at night with an old lantern, searching for something, though no one knew what. One night he disappeared and the cabin was left abandoned. But the legend remained. They called him the Lantern Man, a ghost said to haunt the deepest parts of the reserve, always searching, always watching. I don't know if what we saw that night was real, but I do know one thing. We weren't alone in those woods, and if you ever find yourself deep in Pine Hollow, and you see the flicker of a lantern through the trees, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't look back. I never thought I'd be the type to enjoy camping. The idea of disconnecting from the world, no phone, no Wi-Fi, seemed more like a nightmare than a vacation. But when my friend Eric invited me on this weekend trip to the woods, I figured, why not? I could use the break. It was just going to be me, him, and his girlfriend Sarah. Simple, relaxing. A little fire, some marshmallows, stargazing. Innocent fun. We set out early, the sun shining, birds chirping, the whole postcard scene. The drive took longer than expected, winding down back roads until we reached a secluded spot miles from the nearest sign of civilization. As we set up the tent and unpacked, I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, too quiet. There weren't many birds anymore, no rustling of leaves. Just an oppressive stillness, like the forest was waiting for something. But I brushed it off. I was just a city kid out of his element. By nightfall, we were around the campfire, roasting hot dogs, laughing, the smell of pine and smoke filling the air. Sarah was telling some ridiculous ghost story, the kind you expect on a trip like this, about some ancient spirit who haunted the woods watching campers from the shadows. I didn't take it seriously. None of us did. But then came the sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire. A soft rustling in the trees, like something moving through the brush just beyond the glow of our camp. I tried to laugh it off as a deer or maybe a raccoon, but when Eric stood up with a frown, looking into the dark, I knew he heard it too. Probably just an animal, he said, his voice not entirely convincing. Sarah nodded, though her eyes darted around, scanning the dark edges of the forest. We went back to our conversation, but that uneasy feeling lingered. The night grew colder, the wind picking up, making the trees sway and creak. I swear, every time the fire flickered, I saw movement just out of sight. Shadows shifting, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I told myself it was just the fire playing tricks on me. Around midnight, we called it a night. Sarah went into the tent, and Eric and I stayed up a bit longer, finishing off the last of the beers. That's when we heard it again, louder this time, closer. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eric didn't respond, his eyes locked on the tree line. The firelight barely illuminated the first few rows of trees, and beyond that, pure blackness. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice wavering. There was no answer, just the wind. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night air, but beyond that, nothing. No footsteps, no animals scurrying away. Just silence. "Maybe we should head in," I suggested, my voice low, trying to sound calm. Eric nodded quickly. We zipped ourselves into the tent and lay there in the dark, trying to fall asleep. But the sounds didn't stop. I could hear faint rustling, soft footsteps circling the campsite. Every time I thought they were gone, they'd start up again, closer. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal, but animals don't move like that. It was slow, deliberate. Too human. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, until I heard it. Breathing. Not inside the tent, but right outside. Soft, shallow, deliberate. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath, trying to stay perfectly still, my heart pounding in my chest. The breathing was getting louder, like whoever, or whatever it was right behind the thin fabric of the tent. Then a scratch. Slow, deliberate, something dragging across the tent wall, right where my head was. I couldn't move. I couldn't even bring myself to wake Eric. I just lay there staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, my heart racing. And then the scratching stopped. I don't know how long I stayed awake, terrified, but eventually the sounds faded, and somehow I drifted off. I woke up to daylight and the sound of birds. For a moment I thought maybe it had all been some horrible dream. But then I saw Eric and Sarah standing by the fire pit, staring at something. I crawled out of the tent, rubbing my eyes. "What is it?" I asked. Eric didn't say anything. He just pointed. Footprints. Not animal, human, barefoot. They circled the tent, then led off into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. "We should go," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Eric didn't argue. We packed up in record time, the tension thick between us. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew something had been watching us, something had been there. As we hiked back to the car, the woods seemed different, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. And then, as we neared the car, I noticed something odd, the same footprints, barefoot, leading up to the driver's side door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as Eric and Sarah caught up, and we all saw it at the same time. Sarah gasped, and Eric swore under his breath. The footprints didn't just lead up to the car, they came from inside it. That was when I noticed the back door was slightly open, just a crack. I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach twist into a knot. "No," I whispered. "We locked it, right?" No one answered. Eric, trying to stay calm, opened the door wider, and we all stared inside. There, on the back seat, was a single object that didn't belong to any of us. A mask, worn, dirty, made of some kind of animal hide and shaped like a face. And then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever, or whatever, had been outside our tent last night hadn't just watched us. They had followed us. Camping alone has never bothered me. In fact, I always found it peaceful. No distractions, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of a fire. But after what happened last spring, I haven't camped since. I'm not sure I ever will again. It was a last-minute trip. I had some vacation days to use and the weather was perfect. Clear skies and warm enough that I didn't have to worry about freezing at night. I packed light, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the cold, hollow wilderness. It's one of those places where you could hike for days and never see another soul. Perfect for someone looking for solitude. After a few hours of hiking, I found a nice spot by a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. I set up camp, started a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, casting a deep orange glow across the pond, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't worried about anything. I was alone, miles away from anyone, and that was exactly what I wanted. As the night fell, I sat by the fire, sipping from my thermos and staring into the flames. The forest was quiet, aside from the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started subtly, so subtle that at first I didn't even notice. It was the absence of sound. The wind that had been softly moving through the trees earlier had stopped. The frogs and crickets that had been filling the night with their songs had gone silent. The forest was still, unnaturally still. I looked around, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I could feel it. There's a certain kind of quiet that you don't get used to, even after years of camping alone. A quiet that feels wrong. I tried to brush it off, poking at the fire to keep myself busy, but that feeling of being watched crept in, gnawing at me. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the thick trunks of the trees and the dense underbrush beyond. Then I heard it, a low, steady tapping. It was coming from somewhere in the woods, a rhythmic sound, like someone gently knocking on wood. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker, but it was too slow for that, too deliberate. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, but as soon as the light hit the trees, the tapping stopped. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, something moving around in the underbrush, but the forest was still dead silent. That kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you feel like something is holding its breath. Then the tapping started again, this time closer, much closer. I turned the flashlight back toward the trees, the beam trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, its arms hanging low by its sides, motionless. It stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted, like it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was something wrong with the shape. Something off. The way it stood, the way it didn't move, made my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight trained on it, and slowly, very slowly, I backed toward the fire. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. As I reached the fire, I grabbed a log and threw it into the flames, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The light flared up, casting long shadows through the clearing. For a moment, I looked away from the figure, just for a second. When I turned back, it was gone. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping a stick from the fire, my eyes darting between the trees. I didn't see it again that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, my body rigid with fear, listening to every little sound, expecting that thing to reappear at any moment. But it never did. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my car. The whole way, I felt like something was following me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the trees. I don't know what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me after too much time alone in the woods. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was out there watching me, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear that tapping. Soft, steady, like a knock on wood. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't gone camping since. I'm not sure I ever will again. Because whatever that thing was, I don't think it wanted me to leave. And I'm terrified that one day I'll hear that tapping again, this time much closer. I'll be honest, I'm not a nature guy. But when Mike suggested we take a camping trip, a guy's weekend in the deep woods, I figured, why not? A break from the usual grind sounded good. Mike's a seasoned outdoorsman anyway, so I felt pretty safe tagging along. We drove up to this remote patch of forest he knew about, far from any trails. No cell service, no people, just trees, sky, and the kind of silence you don't realize you miss until it swallows you whole. It was a nice change of pace at first. Peaceful. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the trees that I started to notice something was off. The campfire crackled between us, spitting embers into the darkening sky. Mike was lounging in his chair, looking totally relaxed, like he'd done this 100 times. Me? I kept glancing over my shoulder at the woods. The darkness felt thick, like it was closing in faster than it should. The rustling leaves and snapping twigs suddenly felt less like wind or animals, and more like we weren't alone. I'll grab some more wood, I said, needing an excuse to move, shake the unease crawling up my spine. Mike grunted, barely acknowledging me as I wandered into the trees, flashlight bouncing with each step. I didn't stray far, but even a few yards from the fire, the world seemed to swallow me. The trees stretched taller, the air colder. I was surrounded by the low hum of the forest, the distant call of something. Not a bird, not a coyote. Something else. It didn't sound quite right. My flashlight flickered. I cursed and shook it. Stupid, cheap thing. It stabilized, but for a split second when the light flared back on, I thought I saw something between the trees. A figure. Tall, thin, just standing there watching. I whipped the beam back. Nothing. Just dense forest. The trees swayed gently, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. I headed back to the camp, wood bundled awkwardly in my arms, my heart pounding a little too fast. Mike barely looked up when I tossed the logs by the fire. "Cold already?" he asked, grinning. Yeah, it's getting a bit chilly, I muttered, trying to play off the unease. That's when I heard it again, the call, low, guttural, almost human but not quite, like it was mimicking something it didn't fully understand. I froze. Did you hear that? Mike's grin faltered. What? That sound, it came from over there. He listened for a moment, then shrugged. Probably just a fox or something. I didn't say anything. Foxes don't sound like that. But I wasn't about to argue. I sat down, trying to push the strange call from my mind, chalking it up to my unfamiliarity with the woods. The night dragged on. Every time the wind picked up, I heard that eerie sound again, closer now. Each time, Mike dismissed it. I was starting to wonder if he could even hear it at all. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally crept in. Mike went to his tent first, leaving me alone by the fire. The flames had died down, casting faint orange light around the clearing. I was about to pack it in too when I saw it again. A figure standing just beyond the firelight. My heart seized. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long for its body. The shadows clung to it like it didn't belong in this world. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them, hidden in the black void where a face should be. I stood slowly, not wanting to provoke whatever it was. Mike, get up. There's something out here, I whispered, trying to keep the panic from my voice. He didn't respond. I backed toward his tent, keeping my eyes on the thing. Mike! I hissed louder. Still nothing. I turned and yanked open the tent flap, and my blood ran cold. Mike wasn't there. The sleeping bag was neatly rolled up, untouched. It was like he had never been here at all. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, the fire barely flickering now, casting the world in deep shadows. The figure was gone. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The oppressive silence pressed against my ears, and I realized the woods had gone dead. Not a single sound. No wind, no leaves rustling. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it wildly into the trees. Nothing. Nothing but shadows. And then I heard it. Help! A faint, familiar voice. Mike's voice. But it was wrong. Warped, distorted, coming from the direction of the figure. Mike, I called, desperate, my voice shaking. Help me, it repeated, closer now, almost right beside me. I swung the flashlight around, my breath catching in my throat. Standing just outside the circle of dying firelight was Mike, or something that looked like him. His face was slack, his eyes empty. He smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. Help, me, he said again, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was that same low, guttural sound I'd heard earlier. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This thing wasn't Mikey. I turned to run, but froze. All around the camp, standing between the trees, were more figures, dozens of them, watching, silent. Some tall, others short, but all of them wrong, twisted like they were made of shadows and bones. Their heads tilted, their dark eyes fixed on me. And then I realized none of them were moving. None of them were breathing. They were all watching me, and I understood in that moment something I wish I hadn't. Something terrible. Mike had never existed. There had never been anyone else on this trip, and I was alone. But not really alone. Because they were here, they had always been here, watching. And now, they were waiting for me to join them. As the fire died and darkness swallowed the clearing, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to make it out of these woods. I already belonged to them. There's something about the woods at night that strips you down to your most primal fears. It's the quiet, the isolation, the overwhelming darkness that swallows up everything beyond the reach of your flashlight. That's what I kept telling myself as I sat by the campfire with my friends, trying to shake the growing unease in my gut. This was supposed to be fun. A weekend getaway in the middle of nowhere, away from work, stress, the city. Just me, my girlfriend Emma, and our two friends Mark and Lisa. We were at a place called Black Ridge, deep in the mountains, far from any other campers. The guy at the ranger station had given us this weird look when we mentioned where we were headed, but he didn't say anything, just handed over a map, told us to be careful. I figured he meant bears, or maybe a storm rolling in. But the weather was fine, and as far as wildlife went, we hadn't seen so much as a squirrel. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed about old times. But on the second night, things took a turn. It was around midnight when it started. We were sitting around the fire, finishing up some s'mores, when we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the kind of sound that stood out right away, more like something that just became noticeable once everything else had gone quiet. Mark was the first to say something. "You guys hear that?" We all paused, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was consistent, like someone gently knocking on a door, or a tree. "Probably just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. There was something too deliberate about it, too human. But I didn't want to freak anyone out, especially Emma. She was already a little on edge. She'd heard some local urban legends about these woods, stories about strange sightings and disappearances. I brushed it off as small-town myths. You know how it is. People in isolated places make up stories to explain the things they can't. But the tapping continued. Emma squeezed my hand, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "That's not an animal." We sat there for a while longer, the fire casting flickering shadows across our faces, but none of us said anything. We were all too focused on that sound, trying to figure out what it could be. It was almost hypnotic in its rhythm, like it was drawing us in. Mark finally stood up. "I'm going to check it out." "Are you insane?" Lisa hissed, grabbing his arm. "It's the middle of the night. Whatever that is, you don't want to find out." He shrugged her off, grabbing his flashlight. "It's probably some stupid kids messing with us. We're in the middle of the woods, not a horror movie." Against our better judgment, we let him go. He disappeared into the trees, the beam of his flashlight bobbing through the undergrowth. We all sat in tense silence, listening to his footsteps fade. And then, nothing. The tapping had stopped. A few minutes passed, then 10, then 15. No Mark. "Okay, I'm going after him," I said, standing up and grabbing my own flashlight. Emma tried to protest, but I couldn't just leave him out there. It was probably nothing, I told myself. But the longer I waited, the more my anxiety gnawed at me. I ventured into the woods, the firelight quickly swallowed by the dense trees. My flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness, but I kept going, calling Mark's name. No response. After about 10 minutes of walking, I stopped to listen. That's when I heard it. The tapping again. This time it was closer, louder. And then, mixed in with it, I heard a voice. Faint, barely audible, but definitely human. "Mark," I called out, moving toward the sound. The tapping grew louder, faster, and then I saw something up ahead, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. Movement. I pushed forward, expecting to find Mark messing with me, but instead I stumbled into a small clearing. There was a tree in the center, old and gnarled, its bark twisted and blackened like it had been struck by lightning. But what made me stop cold was what was hanging from it. A row of small wooden figures, each one carved crudely into the shape of a person, dangling by thin twine from the branches. They swayed gently in the breeze, tapping against the tree trunk. And standing beneath them motionless was Mark. "Dude, what the hell?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just stood there staring up at the hanging figures, his back to me. "Mark!" I shouted, my panic rising. I stepped closer, reaching out to grab his shoulder. As my hand touched him, he turned around slowly, his eyes wide, unblinking. His face was pale, blank, like he wasn't really seeing me. "What are you doing out here, man?" I asked, shaking him a little. "We need to get back to camp." He blinked like he was coming out of a trance. I don't know. I thought I heard something. A voice. Calling me. That's when I noticed something in his hand, a small wooden figure just like the ones hanging from the tree. Only this one, it looked different. It had markings carved into it, symbols I didn't recognize, and a small tuft of what looked like hair tied around it. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. Mark nodded, dropping the figure on the ground. We hurried back to camp, neither of us speaking, the eerie tapping still echoing in the distance. When we got back, Emma and Lisa were frantic, but relieved to see us. We didn't tell them about the figures. I didn't even know how to explain it. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those wooden figures swaying in the breeze, heard that rhythmic tapping in the back of my mind. But we made it through the night without further incident, and at first light, we packed up and left. Here's the thing, though. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure Mark had picked up. Something about it seemed familiar. When we got home, I did some digging, researching local legends and stories about Black Ridge. What I found still haunts me. There was a local myth about a family that had lived in the woods back in the early 1900s. The father was a wood carver, known for making strange, cursed totems. It was said that anyone who took one of the figures would be marked, followed by something that lived in the woods, something ancient. The figures were left as warnings, not to be touched. I haven't told Mark about what I found, but last week he called me, frantic. He said he's been hearing tapping outside his window at night, even though he lives on the 3rd floor of his building. I don't think whatever was in those woods stayed there. I'd always been drawn to the idea of camping, getting away from the noise of the world, finding peace in the stillness of nature. But after this trip, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It started innocently enough. I'd been itching for an escape, so when my coworker Ben told me about this hidden campsite deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I was sold. He'd described it as untouched and perfectly remote, the kind of place where you could really disappear for a while. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed light and left early, arriving at the base of the trail mid-afternoon. The drive had been long, and the further I went, the less maintained the road became. By the time I reached the trailhead, it felt like I was miles away from any civilization. No cars, no people, just trees for as far as the eye could see. Exactly what I wanted. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and barely visible in some spots, but I wasn't concerned. I'd been given directions. Follow the river for 2 miles, then head uphill toward the ridge. Simple enough, and it was quiet. Too quiet, actually. As I moved deeper into the forest, I realized I hadn't seen or heard any wildlife. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Just my boots crunching on the dirt and the distant sound of running water from the river. After about an hour, I found the spot Ben had described, a small clearing just above the riverbank, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. It was beautiful. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the canopy in golden beams, and I could hear the river gurgling below. I set up my tent and got a fire going. It was peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched across the clearing, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I laughed it off. I was alone out here, there was no one to watch me, but the feeling lingered. After eating dinner, I sat by the fire staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, the first sign that something was wrong. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was knocking on wood. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, but it was hard to pinpoint. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast and it wasn't frantic, just steady, almost methodical. I turned my head, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. just trees. But the tapping continued, now slightly louder, as if it were getting closer. Probably just a woodpecker, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. There was something off about the sound, something deliberate. The tapping stopped. The fire crackled, and I realized how loud my own breathing had become. I sat there, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a heavy sensation, like a pair of eyes was locked onto me from somewhere in the trees. I decided to call it a night, figuring sleep would help reset my nerves. But as I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, I felt that same prickling sensation return, stronger this time. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, trying to ignore it, but it only got worse. And then there was the tapping again, louder now, unmistakably close. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. The sound had stopped the second I'd moved, but the moment I lowered the light, it started again, this time on the opposite side of the clearing. I whipped around, light flashing through the trees, but still, nothing. That's when I saw it. Movement. Just at the edge of the light's reach. A figure standing perfectly still between two trees. I froze. My hand shook as I tried to focus the beam, but the figure was gone before I could get a clear look. My mind raced. Had I really seen someone, or was it just the shadows playing tricks on me? I didn't wait to find out. Grabbing my pack, I stuffed everything I could into it, not caring about what I left behind. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I was stuffing my things into my bag, I heard something new. Not tapping this time, but a voice, a faint, distant voice calling out from the trees. Help! I stopped, my blood running cold. It sounded like a woman, weak and pleading. Help me, please. It was coming from the direction of the river, where the trees were thickest. Every instinct I had told me to run, but the voice was so desperate, so fragile. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, my heart racing. The voice was getting closer. Please, help! I stopped at the edge of the trees, shining my light toward the river. Nothing, no one. Just the flowing water and the endless stretch of trees. But the voice, it was still there, echoing through the woods, now impossibly close, yet I could see no one. Then the voice changed. It shifted, becoming lower, more distorted. Help. Me. The words sounded wrong, twisted, like something was mimicking a human voice, but getting it just off. Suddenly, the tapping started again, this time right behind me. I turned, my flashlight swinging wildly, but the light barely pierced the darkness. The tapping grew louder, faster, circling me now. My breathing quickened. I was surrounded by it. An invisible chorus of tapping and that awful voice, growing more inhuman by the second. And then I saw it. Between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was the figure again. This time it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted and wrong, like it had been stretched. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale, featureless oval, and from it came that awful, distorted voice. Help. Me. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the trees, the tapping and the voice chasing me all the way to the trail. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but by the time I slammed the door shut and sped down the dirt road, the tapping had finally stopped. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what I heard. When I got back, I asked Ben about that spot, and he seemed confused, said he'd never been there before, never even heard of it. The directions, he said he'd never given them to me. And now every night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it again, faint, far away at first, but always growing closer. Tap, tap, tap. I've never been afraid of the woods, not like some people. Growing up in a small town surrounded by thick forests, I spent most of my childhood exploring trails, building forts, even camping alone as a teenager. The sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of owls, the steady hum of insects, always felt like home to me. Until that night. I had decided to head out for a solo camping trip, something I did at least once every summer. A way to clear my head and get away from the constant barrage of screens, work, and noise. I picked a spot deep in the forest, about 10 miles from the nearest dirt road, far from any popular hiking paths. I wanted isolation. I got it. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the clearing, a small, flat area surrounded by towering pine trees. The air smelled fresh, earthy. There was a calmness to the place, a stillness that felt right. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and by the time the sun started to set, I had a fire going strong. I remember thinking how perfect it all was, the quiet, the solitude. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest darkened, that feeling of peace began to slip away. At first, it was just little things. The way the trees seemed to close in around the clearing as the light faded. The way the shadows stretched and twisted in the firelight, making the forest seem more alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, sat by the fire, roasted some marshmallows, listened to the usual night sounds, crickets, wind in the trees, an occasional owl. But then, there was something else, a rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but this sound was different, more deliberate, like footsteps. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were trees. Still, that sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, continued. It circled the campsite, slow and steady, just beyond the reach of the light. I called out, half expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray hiker who had wandered off course. But no one answered. The footsteps just stopped. I told myself it was an animal, nothing to worry about. I tried to laugh it off, even though every instinct I had was screaming that something wasn't right. I sat back down, poked at the fire, and listened. Everything was silent now. Too silent. The usual chorus of nighttime creatures had gone dead quiet. And then I heard it. A voice. At first it was faint. A whisper carried on the wind, so soft I almost didn't catch it. But as it continued, I realized it wasn't just any whisper. It was my name. Josh. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun the flashlight around the clearing, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The trees stood still, the shadows thick and unmoving. I felt the air grow colder. The voice came again, this time clearer, more distinct. Josh, over here. It was coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of nausea. There was no way anyone could be out here. I was miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd left my truck. But that voice, it sounded familiar. It sounded like my brother. But my brother had been dead for 5 years. I hadn't thought about him in months, maybe even years. His face flashed in my mind, a memory of the last time we'd camped together before the accident. It was a stupid thing, really. He had wandered off the trail while we were hiking, lost his footing, and fell into a ravine. They said he died instantly. I didn't see it happen, but I was there. I found him. His body had been twisted in ways I can't forget, no matter how much I try. But now his voice was calling me from the woods. I stood there, frozen, listening as it called again, more insistent this time. Josh, come here. I need you." I should have left. I should have run straight to my tent, packed up, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. Something about the voice, his voice, pulled at me. Against my better judgment, I stepped away from the fire, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and moved toward the trees. The moment I crossed into the darkness, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. The temperature dropped, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled my nose. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and sputtering. The voice came again, closer now, almost like it was right beside me. "I'm here, Josh, just a little further." I pushed deeper into the woods, the light barely cutting through the shadows. My heart raced, and my breath came in short, shallow bursts. Every step felt wrong, but I couldn't stop. My brother's voice kept pulling me forward. I reached a small clearing, the trees thinning out. The ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and at the center of it stood a figure. It was him, or it looked like him. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were sunken, dark pits that reflected no light. His body was gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long, and his skin seemed to hang loose on his bones. But it was his face, my brother's face. "Josh," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need you to come with me." I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. My brother was dead, buried. This thing in front of me, it wasn't him. But as I stood there, frozen in place, it stepped toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. "You left me," it hissed, its voice warping, distorting. "You let me die." I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down from all sides. The thing that looked like my brother screamed, an ear-piercing wail that echoed through the forest, chasing me. My legs burned as I ran, branches slapping my face, the cold air cutting into my lungs. But I didn't stop. When I finally burst back into my campsite, I collapsed near the fire, gasping for breath. The wailing had stopped. The forest was silent again, but I could feel it watching me. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, and waited for the sun to rise. The moment the first light broke through the trees, I packed up and left. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it sometimes. That voice, my brother's voice, calling from the woods. I've been camping my whole life. Growing up, my dad would take me and my older brother, Jason, out into the wilderness every summer. I'd learned how to set up tents, start fires, and navigate the woods with just a compass and the stars. I thought I knew the woods, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that trip last October. It was just the three of us, Jason, me, and my best friend Dylan. We were heading to a place deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. Jason had heard about this spot from some guy at a bar, some off-the-grid campsite tucked into a valley surrounded by towering pine trees. He swore it was the perfect place for stargazing, totally isolated. We hiked for hours that day, the trail disappearing until we were blazing our own path through the underbrush. By the time we found the spot, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was perfect, just like Jason said. A clearing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick, ancient pines. We set up camp quickly just before dusk. A cool breeze rustled through the treetops, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing around us. We joked around the fire, passing a flask of whiskey, the flames dancing as we swapped old stories. The moon hung high and full above us, casting silver light through the branches. It should have been peaceful, but something was off. I noticed it first, the smell. It wasn't your usual forest scent of pine and earth. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as the night wore on. It smelled like something rotting, like an animal that had died and been left to decay in the woods. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Dylan nodded, glancing around. "Yeah, man. Maybe a deer died nearby or something." Jason shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The smell wasn't normal, and it seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself was steeped in decay. I told myself I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the chill crawling up my spine. As the fire died down and the night grew darker, the noises began. At first it was faint, just a whisper like the wind shifting through the trees. But then I realized it wasn't the wind. It was voices. Low, murmuring voices carried through the night. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, scanning the trees. Jason paused, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, my heart pounding. "It sounds like whispering." Dylan leaned closer to the fire, his face lit up with unease. "It's just the wind, man. You're freaking yourself out." But I knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct, like they were circling us, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Then, without warning, the forest went completely silent. No wind, no insects, no crackling of the fire. Just nothing. I turned to Jason, but before I could speak, we heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. Dylan stood up, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" Jason grabbed his own flashlight, sweeping it through the trees. "Probably an animal," he muttered, but even his voice wavered. We stood there, flashlights cutting through the darkness, hearts pounding in unison, waiting. Then we saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, standing just beyond the reach of our lights. It was watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was too far to see clearly, but something about it was wrong. Its shape was distorted, like it didn't fit the space it occupied, as if the shadows clung to it unnaturally. "Who's there?" Jason called out, trying to sound confident. The figure didn't move. "Dude, let's just pack up and get out of here," Dylan whispered, his voice trembling. Jason shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's just someone messing with us." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew. No one else was supposed to be out here. No one else could be out here. This place was too remote. Suddenly the figure moved, but not toward us. It slipped back into the shadows, vanishing between the trees without a sound. And just like that, the forest came alive again. The wind picked up, the fire crackled, the distant sound of insects resumed. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. Jason didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the woods, his face pale. We sat in silence for a while, no one willing to admit how terrified we were. But after what felt like hours, we finally decided to call it a night. Jason insisted we stay, that it was nothing, just some hiker passing through. But I saw the way his hands shook as he zipped up his tent. I couldn't sleep. Every little sound jolted me awake, my mind replaying the image of that figure over and over again. I lay there, listening to the forest, the whispers creeping back into the edges of my consciousness. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. I shot up, heart racing. They were slow, shuffling, moving through the campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen, praying it was just Jason or Dylan going for a piss break. Then I heard the zipper of Jason's tent. "Jason," I whispered. No response. The footsteps continued, but they weren't moving away. They were circling the tents. Around and around. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent just a crack, peeking out. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I froze. Standing in the middle of the campsite, facing away from me, was Jason. "Jason," I whispered again, louder this time, but he didn't move. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. "Jason, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, unnaturally still, his back to me. As I approached him, my flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I heard it, a whisper, right by my ear. "Run!" I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. When I turned back to Jason, he was gone. Panic surged through me. I ran to Dylan's tent, shaking him awake. "Dylan, we need to go, now." We grabbed our gear, not even bothering to pack everything properly, and bolted. We ran through the woods, not stopping, not looking back. The entire time I could feel it. Something was following us. The whispers grew louder, circling us, closing in. When we finally reached the car, we drove like hell out of there, not saying a word. We never found Jason. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but he was gone. Just gone. No trace, no tracks, nothing. But here's the thing that still haunts me. A week after we returned, I got a text from Jason's number. Just one word. Run. I don't go camping anymore. I've been an avid camper for years, and there's not much I haven't experienced in the wilderness. Bears, storms, strange sounds in the night. None of it phases me anymore. But last summer, I encountered something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Something that changed the way I see the woods forever. It started as a simple solo trip. I'd taken a few days off work, packed up my gear, and headed out to a part of the national forest I'd never explored before. It was about as remote as it gets, way off any marked trails, and that's exactly why I chose it. I wanted some peace and quiet, no distractions, just me and nature. The drive-in was long, and by the time I found a good spot to camp, the sun was already hanging low in the sky. I set up my tent in a small clearing by a river, the sound of the water creating a peaceful backdrop. It was the kind of place you dream about, untouched, serene, and completely isolated. Or so I thought. The first night was calm, nothing out of the ordinary. I sat by the fire, watched the stars, and let the silence of the woods sink in. There were no animal noises, which was odd, but not unheard of in more remote areas. I figured the wildlife was just keeping its distance. The next day I went exploring, hiking through the dense forest, following the river upstream. The forest was thick, the trees gnarled and ancient. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of deer or other animals moving through the trees. But as I hiked deeper, the forest started to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. And then there were the trees, tall and thin, their bark almost black, their branches twisted in unnatural angles, like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something strange. At first I thought it was just an old campsite, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't that at all. In a small clearing, surrounded by those unnerving trees, stood a ring of stones. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one about the size of a football, covered in moss and dirt. But what really caught my attention was what was inside the circle. There were symbols, crudely etched into the dirt, circles, triangles, lines that connected in strange, unnatural patterns. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was almost like a ritual site, but who would come all the way out here to do something like that? I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood there, staring at the stones. The air around me seemed to thicken, the silence pressing down like a weight. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the feeling of being watched became too overwhelming. I turned and headed back to camp, trying to shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my gut. That night things got worse. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the flickering light of the fire. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was subtle at first, almost like someone knocking on wood far off in the distance. But as I sat there, listening, the tapping grew louder, closer. It seemed to echo through the trees, coming from all directions. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. I told myself it was just a woodpecker or some other animal, but it didn't feel right. The sound was too steady, too deliberate. And then just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, gripping the handle of my camp knife, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. The fire crackled, the river flowed, but everything else was still. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the firelight, I saw movement. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing at the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, like the trees themselves. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette, standing impossibly still. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree casting a strange shadow. But then it moved. It took a step toward me, its movement slow and deliberate, almost graceful. The air around me seemed to thicken, the fire dimming as the figure approached. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just sat there, frozen in place, my mind racing. And then, just as it reached the edge of the firelight, it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, me, paralyzed with fear, and it, standing there, its dark, faceless form looming over the campsite. And then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, melting into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, my eyes darting between the trees, waiting for it to come back. But it never did. The next morning, I packed up my gear and left as fast as I could. I didn't care about the rest of the trip, didn't care about exploring anymore. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I hiked back toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear that faint tapping sound again, but every time I stopped to listen, it would disappear. By the time I reached the car, I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there, not looking back once. I've been camping since then, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I don't know what I saw that night, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some places want to be left alone. And sometimes when you ignore that feeling in your gut, the forest sends something to remind you why. I'll never forget the last time I went camping. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the mountains with my girlfriend Jess. We had both been swamped with work for months, and this trip was meant to be a much-needed escape from it all. Just the two of us, a tent, and the stillness of nature. We chose a spot we'd been to a couple of years back, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of place where your phone loses signal, and the only sounds you hear are the wind in the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird. We thought it would be perfect. The hike to the campsite was longer than I remembered. The forest seemed denser this time, more overgrown, like no one had set foot on the trail in years. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the late afternoon sun. By the time we reached the clearing, dusk was already settling in, and we scrambled to set up our tent before dark. Once the tent was up, we got a small fire going and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sky above was a deep, starless black, and the only light came from the flickering flames in our lantern. It was peaceful, at least for a while. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was a tension in the air, like the forest around us was watching. Jess must have felt it too because she kept glancing toward the trees, her brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. I stopped mid-sentence, listening. At first there was nothing, just the usual crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, faint and distant, I heard it too. A low rhythmic sound, like something was scraping against wood. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the fire, but it had an unnatural consistency, like it was deliberate. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind or some animal moving through the underbrush, but deep down, I didn't believe it. Jess shifted closer to me, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "That's not normal, right?" I shook my head slowly. "No, it's not." The scraping continued, slowly growing louder, closer. It sounded like it was circling us, moving through the woods just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the twisted trunks of old pines and tangled brush. The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than before, like the forest itself had frozen in place, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, Jess gasped, "Look!" I turned, following her gaze, and saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the faint glow of the fire. At first, I thought it was a person, someone lost, maybe. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't right. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long and spindly. It stood perfectly still, just watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette, an unnatural shape that seemed almost part of the forest itself. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "We need to go," I whispered. Jess nodded, eyes wide with fear. We both moved slowly, trying not to draw attention. But the moment I grabbed my backpack, the figure took a step forward. That's when I noticed its face, and there wasn't one. Where the face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, pale and almost glowing in the faint light. The thing's body seemed to ripple, like its shape wasn't fixed, like it was constantly shifting in the dark. "We're leaving," I called out, my voice shaky. "We don't want any trouble." But it didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, except for the slow, disturbing flow of its body. I threw my pack over my shoulder, and Jess grabbed her gear. We began backing away, keeping our eyes on the figure, but every few steps it would move closer, always just at the edge of the firelight. Then, without warning, the fire went out. It didn't flicker or die down. It just vanished, as if something had snuffed it out all at once. We were plunged into darkness. Jess screamed, and I fumbled with my flashlight, heart racing. When I finally managed to click it on, the figure was gone. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jess's hand. We bolted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly as we ran through the underbrush. The trees closed in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin as we pushed through the dense forest. I could hear Jess's panicked breathing beside me, and somewhere behind us, the sound of those same slow, deliberate footsteps. It was following us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to blur, and the forest felt endless, like it was twisting and shifting, trying to trap us. Every time I glanced back, I saw nothing, but I could feel it behind us, just out of sight, chasing us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled out onto the main trail. Our car was still parked at the trailhead, and we didn't waste a second. We threw our gear in the trunk, jumped in, and sped down the mountain road without looking back. We didn't speak the entire drive home. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we had seen, what had chased us through the woods. But I know it wasn't a dream, and I know Jess felt the same. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us back. Sometimes late at night, I hear that same scraping sound outside my window, faint but unmistakable. And once, just once, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of my yard, tall, spindly, and watching. I never go camping anymore. I always loved camping. The solitude, the way the air smells like pine and damp earth, and the peace that comes from being so far from civilization. This year, I decided to go alone. A solo trip into the dense woods, remote, deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't hear or see anyone else for days. It was supposed to be peaceful. The hike to the spot I picked was long, almost 5 hours from where I parked my car, the trees growing thicker the farther I went. The light struggled to penetrate the canopy, making the forest floor feel dim even in the middle of the day. I liked it. It felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold, leaving the world behind. I set up camp by a small clearing with a narrow stream cutting through the underbrush nearby. The water made this soft, constant burble that was almost hypnotic. Perfect white noise. After getting everything ready, tent pitched, firewood gathered, food prepared, I settled in for the evening, watching the sun slowly dip behind the trees. It got dark fast. Really dark. I'm used to the night in the woods, but this was different. It was thick, like the shadows clung to the trees, stretching and growing, swallowing up the little light left. The fire crackled, casting flickering shapes that danced around the edge of the clearing. It felt like something was watching me from the tree line, just beyond the fire's reach. It was the first time I felt uneasy. I brushed it off. I mean, it's easy to get spooked out here, alone with just your thoughts and the wilderness. So, I sat close to the fire and stared into the flames, trying to let it calm me down. Eventually I fell asleep, the cold creeping in as the fire died out. Then came the first night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft, crunching footsteps like something or someone was walking around my tent. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, straining to hear. The footsteps would move, pause, and then shuffle again. It circled the tent, slow and deliberate. It's just an animal, I told myself. Probably a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it. A whisper. At first it was so faint I wasn't sure I heard it. But there it was again. A soft, almost unintelligible murmur, like someone whispering right next to the fabric of the tent. My heart pounded. I forced myself to unzip the tent, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the area. Nothing. No one. The woods were still. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of insects in the distance. I laughed nervously, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But the unease stuck with me. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent hours hiking, exploring, trying to enjoy the isolation I came here for. But something was off. No matter where I went, it felt like the forest was watching me. The trees stood too still, the wind too silent, and then I noticed something strange. The temperature was dropping. It was subtle at first, a chill in the air that didn't belong in the middle of summer. As the day went on, the drop became more noticeable. By late afternoon, I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and despite the layers of clothes, I couldn't shake the cold. When I returned to camp, there was frost on the grass, clinging to the leaves like it was the dead of winter. That night it got worse. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't footsteps that roused me. It was voices. Clear, distinct voices, more than one, whispering just outside my tent. They weren't speaking in a language I recognized, more like the low murmur of something ancient, something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tight, but I didn't open the tent. I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, moving around me just like the footsteps the night before. And then, from one side of the tent, I heard something press against the fabric. Just for a second, a light touch that sent a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't stay there. I didn't care if it was an animal or a trick of the wind or even my own mind. I was done. I packed up in the dark, fumbling with my gear, trying not to look too hard into the trees. It felt like something was waiting out there, just beyond the firelight. When I finally started hiking out, it was almost dawn, but the forest seemed darker than ever. The path looked different, twisted, like the trees had moved overnight. The cold clung to me, and the whispers, God, those whispers, they followed me, always just out of reach. Then I saw the footprints. At first they were scattered, hard to make out, but as I walked, they became more clear. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and there were dozens of them, all around me. Some looked fresh, others older, like they had been there long before I arrived. The worst part, they weren't just on the ground. Some of the prints went up the sides of trees like something had crawled up the bark, dragging itself higher into the canopy. I quickened my pace, practically running now, desperate to get out of the woods, to see the road, my car, anything that wasn't this endless, oppressive forest. Finally, I saw it, the edge of the woods, the clearing where I parked my car. But something was wrong. The car, it was covered in frost, thick white frost, like it had been sitting there for weeks, untouched. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached for the door, but the metal was icy, freezing to the touch. As I tried to open it, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A reflection. In the window there was a face, not mine, not anyone I'd ever seen. Pale, twisted, hollow-eyed, it stared back at me from the inside of the car, and behind it, the forest, the trees, those endless, whispering trees. I never made it out of the woods, not really, because every time I try to leave, I end up back here. The same clearing, the same frost, the same face in the window. The forest doesn't let you go. It just keeps you watching, waiting until you're part of it too. I should have known better. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, just me and my brother Mark. A simple camping trip, nothing fancy. Hiking during the day, campfires at night, and no responsibilities in between. It was something we hadn't done since we were kids, and I was looking forward to disconnecting from the grind for a couple of days. We chose a spot deep in the woods, a place Mark had heard about from some guys at work. They called it the Hollow. According to them, it was the perfect campsite. Remote, untouched, and completely off the beaten path. No other campers, no noisy tourists, just us and nature. The drive took hours, deeper into the forest than I'd ever been. As we neared the campsite, the road became little more than a dirt trail winding through the trees. It was beautiful, sure, but something about the woods felt wrong. The trees were taller than I'd expected, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, like they had grown under constant strain. But I didn't say anything. Mark was excited, and I wasn't about to ruin the mood with some gut feeling. By the time we reached the clearing and set up camp, the sun was starting to set. The place was gorgeous, no doubt about it. The clearing sat at the edge of a small hill, overlooking the dense forest below. The air was crisp, and the sky was slowly turning shades of orange and pink. It should have been peaceful. But something was off. It started with the silence. After we set up the tent and started the fire, I realized I couldn't hear any birds. No animals. No wind rustling through the leaves. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Mark didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. He was too busy cracking open beers and talking about how great it was to get away from everything. But as the sun sank lower, the unease crept in, gnawing at me. I felt like I was being watched. You know that sensation, like someone's eyes are on you, just out of sight. I kept glancing into the trees, trying to shake it, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the forest, growing darker by the minute. After a while, Mark suggested we hike up to the ridge a little higher up to get a better view of the sunset. Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights, just in case, and started walking up the hill. The forest was dense, the trees closing in around us as we moved further from the clearing. The silence was almost unbearable now, like the world was holding its breath. Halfway up the trail, we came across something strange. A large tree, its bark stripped completely off, leaving it pale and smooth like bleached bone. That wasn't the weird part, though. Carved into the trunk was a symbol, a crude circular shape with jagged lines cutting through it. I had no idea what it was supposed to be, but it gave me the creeps. Mark just laughed it off. Probably some old hunting sign or something, he said. Nothing to worry about. I wanted to believe him, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. We reached the ridge just as the last light of the sun was fading. The view should have been spectacular, but I couldn't enjoy it. My skin was crawling, like the air itself was thick with something wrong. I scanned the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and more silence. Then Mark froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Tall, thin, standing motionless in the trees below us, barely visible in the dim light. There were at least 5 of them, standing in a line at the edge of the forest, just beyond the clearing where our camp was. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice catching in my throat. Mark raised his flashlight, but the beam barely touched them. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. Their faces, or whatever passed for faces, were indistinguishable in the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on us, staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We should go back," I said, my voice shaky. Mark didn't argue. We practically ran back down the hill, the darkness closing in around us. By the time we reached the clearing, the fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. But the figures were gone. The edge of the forest was empty, just trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. Mark tried to laugh it off. "Probably just some other campers messing with us," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. We doused the fire and crawled into the tent, trying to shake the feeling of unease, but it clung to us like a second skin. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every rustle in the leaves outside made my heart pound. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, whispers. Faint, barely audible, like someone was standing just outside the tent, talking in low voices. I held my breath, listening. The words were unintelligible, distorted, but I could tell there were multiple voices, and they were getting closer. I nudged Mark, but he was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. He'd heard them too. Without saying a word, we grabbed our flashlights and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the night. The campfire was completely out now, the darkness nearly impenetrable. But the whispers, they were everywhere, coming from all sides, surrounding us. I shined my flashlight toward the trees, and that's when I saw them again. The figures. Taller than before, impossibly tall, their limbs long and thin, like they'd been stretched. They stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, their faces still hidden in the shadows. But this time there were more of them, dozens, all standing perfectly still, just watching us. The whispers grew louder, rising in pitch until they were all I could hear, filling my head with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. I grabbed Mark, my heart hammering in my chest. "We need to go. Now." We didn't bother packing up. We just grabbed our bags and bolted for the car, running through the dark, the figures never moving, but somehow always just on the edge of our vision. The whispers followed us, growing louder and louder, until they were almost screams echoing in the trees. We reached the car, and Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. We jumped inside, and as the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the clearing. The figures were standing at the edge of the road now, impossibly tall, their faces still hidden in shadow. But just before Mark floored the gas, I saw one of them move, its head tilting slightly to the side, like it was acknowledging us, like it was smiling. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the trees thinning out as we approached the main road. The whispers were gone, the night silent once again. But the feeling, that feeling of being watched, it never left. We never went back to the hollow, and we never talked about it again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear them, the whispers, and I know they're still watching. We weren't supposed to camp there. I mean, technically, it wasn't even on the map, this little clearing deep in the woods way off any official trail. But when my buddy Matt found it during one of his solo hikes, he swore it was the perfect spot for an authentic wilderness experience. So naturally, when he suggested a weekend camping trip, the 4 of us, me, Matt, his girlfriend Tara, and my brother Luke, agreed. It took us hours to get there, well beyond the usual campsites and hiking paths. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. It was beautiful, though. Tall pines all around, the sky a deep orange, and the kind of quiet that you only find far away from civilization. We set up camp quickly. The fire crackled, and the stars began to peek out. We were laughing, passing around snacks, and talking about the usual stuff when Luke pointed something out. "Do you guys notice how quiet it is?" At first I thought he was just talking about the usual peacefulness of the woods, but then I realized what he meant. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. The fire made its soft crackling noises, and we made small talk, but that was it. The rest of the world was still. "Maybe we're just that far out," Tara said, trying to lighten the mood, but I could see her glancing around like she was expecting something to jump out at her. It wasn't until later, after the fire started to die down and the stars shone bright above us, that things got weird. We were getting ready to turn in for the night when we heard it. Footsteps. Not just one or two, but the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking just beyond the circle of light from our fire. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Matt whispered. None of us answered, but we all heard it, crunching, deliberate footsteps in the dead leaves, pacing around the perimeter of our camp. "Hello?" Luke called out, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but nothing moved. The footsteps stopped, just as abruptly as they had started. We waited, listening, our breath catching in our throats. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I broke the silence. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. No one really responded. We just sat there staring into the dark, waiting for something else to happen. When it didn't, we decided to head to our tents. Luke and I shared one, while Matt and Tara took the other. I was lying in my sleeping bag staring at the roof of the tent when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were slower, closer, circling around us like something was inspecting the camp. "Luke, you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he muttered back, his voice barely audible. "Maybe it's a deer." The sound of footsteps, human-like footsteps, doesn't sound like a deer. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, moving deliberately, too close for comfort. I didn't sleep much that night, and from the way Luke kept shifting in his sleeping bag, I knew he didn't either. The next morning, when we all gathered around the fire to make breakfast, Matt looked pale. He hadn't slept well either, and Tara seemed even worse. She kept rubbing her arms, saying she felt cold, even though it wasn't that chilly. "I had this weird dream last night," she said, her voice shaky. "I dreamt that something was standing outside the tent, just watching us. I could hear it breathing, but when I tried to look, I couldn't move." Matt glanced at her, then at us. I had the same dream. Luke and I exchanged looks. We hadn't had any dreams, but those footsteps weren't our imaginations. There was something out there last night. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk through the woods, maybe explore the area a bit and shake off the weird vibe from the night before. But as we packed up, Luke froze, his eyes wide, staring at the ground just beyond the fire pit. "Guys, come look at this." We all moved over to where he was standing, and there, pressed into the dirt, were footprints. Bare footprints. Human footprints. They circled the camp in a perfect ring, some overlapping where someone or something had walked back and forth in the night. "No way," I muttered, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. "Who the hell would be out here barefoot in the middle of the night?" Tara stepped back, her face pale. "We didn't hear anyone leave. We didn't hear anyone come into camp either." Matt crouched down, inspecting the prints. "These are fresh," he said quietly, "but there's something weird." We all looked closer. The prints weren't just footprints. They were long, too long, like the toes were stretched out unnaturally, the arch of the foot distorted. They weren't human, not exactly, Luke backed away, shaking his head. "Okay, this is messed up. We need to leave." But Matt, ever the stubborn one, didn't want to go. "It's probably some kind of animal. We're just spooking ourselves out." Tara wasn't having it. "Animal? That's not an animal, Matt. That's something else." After a tense argument, we decided to pack up and head back toward the trail. But as we were gathering our gear, the woods fell silent again, completely and unnervingly still. Then came the laughter. It started faint like a child's giggle drifting through the trees. Then it grew louder, more distinct, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, echoing all around us. High-pitched, unnatural, like something was mocking us. "Let's go, now," I said, not waiting for anyone to agree. We grabbed our gear and started hiking back toward the trail, the eerie laughter following us, growing fainter and fainter but never completely fading. We didn't stop, didn't speak, just walked as fast as we could until we finally reached the trailhead hours later, our legs burning and our nerves shot. As we piled into the car, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see something standing at the edge, watching us leave. But there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. None of us spoke much on the drive home. We didn't know how to explain what had happened, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want to. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. When we got back and started unpacking the car, Tara found something in her backpack. A small carved wooden figure, shaped like a person. It wasn't there when we packed up that morning, and none of us had seen it before. But it was there, tucked into the side pocket of her bag. And when we looked closely, we saw that its face was smiling. I didn't mean to camp alone. It was supposed to be a weekend trip with friends, but one by one they all bailed. Either too busy or not in the mood for roughing it, they left me to go solo. Still, I was stubborn. I wasn't going to let a little isolation ruin my plans. After all, I loved camping. What's the worst that could happen? I found a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from any main trails. It was perfect, untouched, quiet, serene. The nearest town was miles away, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird call. The world felt distant, and for the first time in months I felt peaceful. Setting up camp was easy enough. I pitched the tent, collected firewood, and settled in for a calm night under the stars. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped, and the shadows stretched longer, the thick wood slowly turning into a black wall around me. As I sat by the fire, sipping from a cup of instant coffee, I noticed something strange. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just silence. The kind that crawls under your skin and makes your heart race for no reason. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe the wildlife just moved deeper into the woods. Maybe the wind had died down. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A distant sound, like laughing. It wasn't the hearty kind. It was soft, almost like a child's giggle carried on the breeze. I froze. My rational mind told me it had to be some trick of the wind, or my imagination playing games with me. But the longer I listened, the more distinct it became. High-pitched, soft, but eerily close. It was coming from the direction of the tree line. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and swept the beam across the trees. The laughing stopped instantly. The silence was back, oppressive and complete. "Hello?" I called out, regretting it as soon as the word left my lips. My voice seemed to vanish into the woods, swallowed by the thick darkness. No reply, no movement. I scanned the tree line again, the flashlight beam jittering slightly as my hand shook. Nothing. I chuckled nervously to myself, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just an animal, a fox or some other creature making strange noises. I threw another log on the fire and sat back down, trying to enjoy the warmth, but the unease lingered, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The darkness beyond the firelight felt heavier now, as if something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. I couldn't stop thinking about the laughter. An hour passed, maybe 2. I had finally started to relax when I heard it again. This time it was much closer, just beyond the ring of light cast by the fire. The same laugh, but now accompanied by something else, whispering. Low, indecipherable whispers, like several voices speaking at once. My skin prickled with goosebumps and I stood up again, shining the flashlight into the darkness. "Is someone there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The whispering stopped abruptly. The air was cold now, colder than it should have been for a late summer night. I backed toward the fire, the warmth no longer comforting, but feeling more like a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I should have left then, packed my things and hiked back to the car, but some stubborn part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I wasn't a child. There was no such thing as ghosts. The mind plays tricks in the dark. That's all. I sat down, trying to distract myself by poking at the fire. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I heard the footsteps. They were soft, slow, and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot, coming from the same direction as the whispers. I whipped the flashlight around again, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The beam of light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just beyond the tree line, but I could hear it. Those unmistakable footsteps getting closer. My breath quickened. "Who's there?" I called out louder this time, and no answer. Then from the corner of my eye I saw movement. Something darted between the trees, just at the edge of the light. I spun toward it, flashlight shaking. "I'm warning you. I've got a knife," I yelled, though the knife was still buried somewhere in my pack. There was a pause, silence, and then the laughter started again. But this time, it was all around me, surrounding me, giggling, like children playing hide-and-seek in the dark. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I grabbed my gear and started stuffing it into my bag. I didn't care if it was organized. I just needed to get out of there. The laughter grew louder, the whispers now overlapping into a disorienting hum. My hands shook as I fumbled with the tent, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight, a figure stood between 2 trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body unnaturally thin, arms hanging too low at its sides. The thing's face, it had no face, just smooth pale skin where features should have been. My blood ran cold. It stood there motionless, watching, or at least I think it was watching. The laughter continued, louder now, almost deafening. And then, just as I was about to run, it moved, not in the way a person moves. It jerked, its body contorting unnaturally, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings, stepping forward in sudden violent motions. I stumbled back, tripping over the fire pit, scattering embers everywhere. The laughter was deafening now, overlapping with the whispers, the footsteps. So many footsteps. I grabbed my bag, not even caring what I left behind, and ran. I didn't stop, not even when I heard something following me, crashing through the underbrush, the giggling ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I don't even remember how I got there, but I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sped down that dark, narrow road faster than I should have. I didn't look back. The next morning, after some sleep and convincing myself it was all in my head, I considered going back to get my things. But when I checked my phone, I saw a notification. It was a voicemail. No caller ID. I hesitated, then hit play. All I heard was faint laughter and a soft whisper. "You'll be back." I never thought a simple camping trip could turn into a nightmare, but I suppose that's how these things always go. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for me and my girlfriend Claire to unplug from the world. We'd found this remote spot in the mountains online, one of those off-the-grid places that hardly anyone knows about. The pictures looked perfect, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, a little stream running nearby, and best of all, no cell service. I could already feel the stress melting away as we drove deeper into the wilderness. The narrow dirt road twisted through the trees, and with each mile, the world felt further and further behind us. Claire was excited, pointing out birds and wildflowers along the way. But there was something about the road that made me uneasy. The deeper we went, the narrower and more overgrown it became. It wasn't on any of the maps we had, and there were no signs of other campers, no other cars, no signs of trails, just this seemingly forgotten path that led deeper into nowhere. "We're really out here," I said with a chuckle, trying to shake the strange feeling creeping over me. Claire smiled, but even she seemed a little uneasy now. "That's the point, right? To get away from it all." We finally arrived at the campsite just before sunset. It was just as secluded as the pictures had promised. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. No trash, no worn paths, just untouched wilderness. We set up the tent quickly, trying to beat the fading light, and by the time the fire was going, the first stars were already peeking through the trees. For the first couple of hours, it was perfect. We cooked dinner over the fire, laughed, and listened to the soft sounds of the forest around us. The night air was cool, and the crackling fire was the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. But after a while, Claire started acting strange. It was subtle at first. She would stop mid-conversation, her head cocked slightly to the side like she was listening for something. I asked her what was wrong, but she just shrugged, brushing it off as nothing. Then, about an hour later, she froze. Her eyes locked onto the tree line, staring at something just beyond the fire's glow. "What is it?" I whispered, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She didn't answer for a long moment, just kept staring. Then, without looking away from the trees, she said in a low voice, "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the crackle of the fire. "I don't hear anything." Her face tightened, and she slowly stood up. "It's coming from the woods, like footsteps." I stood up too, my heart starting to race. "Claire, I don't hear anything. Maybe it's an animal." But she was already walking toward the trees, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if something was pulling her forward. I grabbed her arm before she could go any further. "Claire, wait." She snapped out of it, blinking rapidly as if waking from a dream. I thought I heard someone out there." I glanced into the dark woods, but there was nothing, just shadows and the faint outline of the trees in the moonlight. Still, the uneasiness was growing inside me. "Let's just sit back down. We're in the middle of nowhere. No one's out here." Reluctantly, she came back to the fire, but her mood had shifted. She was quieter, more distant, her eyes darting to the forest every few minutes. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. We sat in silence for a while before Claire suddenly stood up again. "I'm going to the bathroom," she said, her voice flat. I nodded, watching her walk toward the trees with a flashlight. I kept my eyes on her, feeling a strange sense of dread as she disappeared into the darkness. The seconds ticked by, and then minutes. I tried to shake off the anxiety creeping up my spine, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the direction Claire had gone. "Claire?" I called out, but there was no response. I stood up, my heart pounding, and took a few steps toward the woods. The fire flickered behind me, casting long shadows as the footsteps grew louder. "Claire, this isn't funny," I shouted, fear gnawing at me. Then she emerged from the trees, but something was off. She was walking too slowly, her head tilted to one side, her hair falling in front of her face. The flashlight hung loosely in her hand, the beam pointing at the ground, flickering weakly. "Claire?" I asked again, my voice shaky. She stopped just at the edge of the firelight, her face still obscured by her hair. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stepped closer, but something in me screamed not to. "What did you see?" Her head slowly lifted, her eyes locking onto mine through the curtain of her hair. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too wrong. "They're waiting for us," she said, her voice unnatural, almost sing-song. I took a step back, my blood running cold. "What are you talking about?" She took a step forward, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "In the woods. They've been watching us the whole time." I stumbled back toward the tent, my mind racing. This wasn't Claire. Something was wrong. Something had changed in her. Without warning, she lunged toward me, her smile twisting into a grotesque grin as she whispered, "You can't leave. They won't let you." I scrambled backward, falling over the tent, and that's when I heard it. The same soft, deliberate footsteps I had heard before. Only this time they weren't coming from Claire. They were coming from behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and there, just at the edge of the trees, were shapes. Dark figures standing motionless in the shadows, watching us. Watching me. I don't know how I did it, but I ran. I grabbed the car keys and bolted for the car, my legs barely carrying me as the footsteps and whispers followed me through the trees. I didn't look back. I drove away that night, leaving everything behind. Claire, the tent, all of it. I told the police what happened, but they never found her. Just the campsite, torn apart, and the flashlight lying in the dirt. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear her voice. They're waiting. Camping has always been my escape from the chaos of life. No deadlines, no emails, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I thought this trip would be no different, but I was wrong. Very wrong. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo trip to Pine Ridge Forest, a place I'd heard about but never visited. It was remote, far from any major trails, and that was exactly what I wanted. I needed the isolation, the quiet, a chance to clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead, and hicked about 3 miles into the woods. The forest felt entooched, ancient even. The trees towered above me, their branches intertwining like they were trying to keep something hidden beneath them. I found a small clearing next to a creek and decided to set up camp. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my fire was crackling, casting long shadows across the trees. The air was cool, and the forest around me buzzed with the usual sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional owl hoot. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. But then, as night truly settled in, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind that had been gently swaying the branches above suddenly stilled. I sat by the fire, poking at the flames, trying to ignore the silence pressing in around me. It was unsettling. Then I heard it, a sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. At first, it was faint, like a far-off echo. It was a laugh. Not a cheerful, hearty laugh, but something wrong. It was distant, yet distinct, almost like it was inside my head. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the dark woods. The beam flickered across the trees, revealing nothing but endless darkness beyond the circle of my campfire. The laugh stopped as soon as the light hit the edge of the clearing. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was off. I sat back down, trying to focus on the fire, but then it came again, this time closer. It sounded like a child's laugh, soft, high-pitched, but with no joy in it. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish for speaking into the darkness. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight in one hand, the fire crackling weakly at my feet. But the laugh didn't return. Maybe it had just been my imagination after all. Finally, the tension eased, and I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped myself up in my tent, the warmth of my sleeping bag wrapping around me, and for a while, the quiet felt comforting. But as I started to drift off, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Someone or something was walking just outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow, straining to hear more. The steps were uneven, as though whatever it was dragging one foot or limping. The sound moved closer, circling my tent. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The beam pierced the fabric of the tent, casting long, distorted shadows outside. The footsteps stopped, but I could hear something breathing. Deep, ragged breaths, just inches from where I lay. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just lay there paralyzed with fear. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more breathing, and I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light of dawn finally crept into the clearing, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was still cold, and a thin layer of dew clung to everything. I scanned the campsite, expecting to find footprints or some sign of what had been out there. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, the fire reduced to ashes, and the creek bubbled along as though nothing had happened. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself that it had been a dream, that the isolation was just playing tricks on me. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Just beyond the clearing, carved deep into the trunk of a tree, were 3 words: "We found you." The letters were jagged, almost gouged into the bark, like they had been scratched in a hurry. My hands shook as I touched the rough cuts, fresh and unmistakable. I hadn't heard anything like carving in the night. I should have heard something, but I hadn't. I grabbed my pack and left, walking fast, almost running down the trail, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees, but I never did. The hike back felt longer than the way in, and when I finally reached the car, I jumped in and sped out of there, not looking back once. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over it in my head 100 times trying to find some rational explanation. But that laugh, those footsteps, and the words carved into the tree. I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. And every now and then, late at night, I hear that same laugh, soft, high-pitched, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I haven't been camping since.